The truck smelled like coffee and gun oil and a particular kind of anticipation that only comes around once a year. Don had been up since 4, which was nothing new. He was always up before everyone else on drive day, moving around the kitchen in the dark, loading the cooler, checking the gear list he had written out the night before, even though he had the same list memorized after 11 years of doing this exact thing. Ray showed up at 5:15 with a paper bag of gas station breakfast sandwiches and a large coffee he had already put a dent in, and he came to the front door without knocking away he had been doing since he married Don's sister 12 years ago. Mitch pulled up right at 5:30, which was exactly when he said he would, because Mitch had never been late to a single thing in his life. Cal was 11 minutes behind him, which was the best anyone had ever gotten out of Cal on an early morning, and he came up the driveway with Diesel hanging half out the passenger window of his truck and Buck already loaded in the bed, tail going like a propeller. They stood in the driveway in the dark for a few minutes, eating the sandwiches Ray brought. The kind of easy, comfortable silence that only exists between people who have known each other long enough that they do not need to fill every quiet moment with noise. Don had known Ray since they were teenagers. He had known Mitch since his first week of basic training. Two young guys from different states who ended up in the same bunk row and stayed close long after they were both out. Cal was younger than the rest of them by almost a decade, Ray's co-worker originally, and he'd been folded into the group so gradually that it was hard to remember a time before him. He was 31 now and still the youngest by enough a margin that the other three gave him grief about it on a rotating basis. It was that kind of group. The drive up was 3 hours on a good day, longer if they hit any weather, and they took in a loose 2-truck convoy the way they always did, with Don leading and Cal following behind. The first hour was highway, town still close enough together that the radio worked, and there were fast food signs every few miles. Ray spent most of that stretch going through Don's playlist and making commentary on every song, which was something Don had learned to tune out over the years, the way you learn to tune out a particular noise your house makes. Mitch rode with Cal in the second truck, which was a usual arrangement, the two of them quiet and comfortable where Ray needed an audience for his running commentary. The second hour was where the town started spacing out, and the hills started showing up in the distance, and the highway became a two-lane road that wound up to the tree lines instead of cutting straight through them. The radio faded in and out, and then gave up entirely somewhere around the halfway point, which was also usual, and Ray switched to telling a long story about something that happened at work that Don mostly followed. The third hour was where it always started feeling like a different world. The road narrowed again, gravel showing up at the edges of the asphalt, the trees pressing in close on both sides, and the sky reduced to a strip above the road. Cell signal dropped out past the second ridge the way it always did, that little notification disappearing from the top of the phone screen. And Don always felt the same thing when it happened, a loosening, like something in his chest unclenching. Out here, nothing could reach him. No work emails, no schedule, no obligations beyond the four of them and the woods, and however many days they had before they had to go back to being the people they were the rest of the year. He had been coming here since he was 26 years old. Ed Calhoun had been renting the cabin out seasonally for as long as Don could remember, a straightforward arrangement. Cash left in the lockbox by the door, key inside, no questions asked, no check-in time, no checkout hassle. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, a 4-room structure that had been out here long enough that the logs had gone dark with age, and the porch sagged slightly on the left side in a way that had never gotten worse in 11 years, so Don had stopped worrying about it. 2 bedrooms, a main room with a wood stove, a kitchen that had everything you needed and nothing you did not. No television, no Wi-Fi, a landline that worked maybe half the time depending on the weather. Don loved it more than almost any place he had ever been. They pulled up the long dirt track to the cabin just after 8 in the morning with the light coming through the trees at that low October angle that made everything look gold and sharp. Cal parked beside Don, and they all got out stretching and Buck, and Diesel hit the ground running the way they always did after a long ride, both of them bolting for the tree line to burn off the energy they had been sitting on for 3 hours. Except they did not. Buck made it maybe 20 feet from the truck and stopped. Diesel pulled up right beside him a second later. Both dogs stood at the edge of the yard where the mowed grass gave way to the tree line, and they did not move, hackles raised along both their spines, and the sound that came out of Buck was low and continuous, and not quite a growl, more like a sustained warning that he could not decide whether to commit to. Diesel's ears were flat. Ray watched him for a second and said probably caught a scent, bear maybe, and Don nodded and said yeah probably, and grabbed a bag from the truck bed and headed for the cabin. The key was in a lockbox where it always was, and the door swung open into that particular smell of old wood and cold air and a faint ghost of every fire that had ever been burned in the wood stove. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked back at the yard. Both dogs were still at the tree line, still not moving, still watching whatever they were watching in the dark between the trees. Don looked at the tree line for a moment himself. Just trees. The same trees that had always been there. He went inside and started unloading. They spent the rest of the morning getting settled the way they always did, gear distributed between the 2 bedrooms, food stocked in the kitchen, wood brought in from the pile at the side of the cabin, and stacked by the stove. Mitch got the fire going early because the October air had teeth this year, a cold front that had come the week before and had not moved, and by early afternoon the main room was warm, and they were sitting around with the first beers of the trip talking about nothing in particular, the way you do when you have just arrived somewhere and the whole week is still ahead of you. The dogs had come inside eventually, both of them settling on the floor near the stove, but neither of them had fully relaxed. Buck kept his head up, eyes toward the window. Diesel circled twice before lying down, and even then his ears kept moving. Don noticed it and did not say anything. They ate dinner early and played cards for a couple of hours, and by 9:30 the day's driving had caught up with everyone, and they started drifting toward bed one by one. Don banked the fire and turned off the lights in the main room and stood at the kitchen window for a minute with a glass of water, looking out at the yard. The moon was thin, and the yard was mostly dark, the tree line a solid black wall at the far edge. He stood there drinking his water and letting his eyes adjust, and that was when he saw it, at the edge of the trees, just inside the shadow where the moonlight did not reach. Something pale, something tall and very thin, standing completely still with its face toward the cabin. Don stood at the window and looked at it, and it looked back, and neither of them moved for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a few seconds. Then Don set his glass down on the counter and told himself it was a deer. He had seen deer stand like that before, facing straight on, and in the dark with tired eyes things looked different than they were. He told himself that, and he went to bed, and he lay there in the dark for a long while before he finally fell asleep. In the morning, he did not mention it to the others. He almost did twice, but each time he stopped himself because in the daylight with coffee in his hand, and Ray giving Cal a hard time about something at the kitchen table, it felt like nothing, like a tired man spooked by a deer at the edge of the woods. And he did not want to be that guy. He would think about that decision for a long time afterward. The whole first day sat in his memory later as something golden and ordinary, the last ordinary thing any of them had for the rest of that week, and he could never decide if that made it better or worse to think about. Nobody said anything about the silence at breakfast, but everybody felt it. Don was up first again, same as always, and he stood on the porch with his coffee in the gray pre-dawn light and listened to the woods, and what he heard was nothing. No birds, no squirrels moving in the leaves, no distant crows the way there always were in the mornings up here. Just a flat, dead quiet that sat over the tree line like something had been pressed down over the whole forest and held there. He told himself it was the cold front. Animals went quiet and hard cold sometimes, hunkered down, waited it out. He told himself that, and went back inside and did not mention it. They headed out just after first light, four of them splitting into two pairs the way they always did. Don with Ray working the northeast ridge, and Mitch taking Cal down to the lower draw where the deer trails crossed. The plan was to push through until mid-morning, loop back, compare notes over lunch. It was a good plan, and it fell apart within the first hour because there was nothing out there, no tracks in the soft ground along the creek bed that Don and Ray followed up toward the ridge. No rubs on the trees, no scrapes, no sign that anything had moved through the area recently at all. Ray noticed it before Don said anything, stopped at the creek crossing and looked both ways along the bank, and said this is weird, and Don said yeah, and neither of them said anything else about it. On the way back down they found the tree. It was a big white oak maybe 30 yards off the trail, and what stopped Don was the height of the marks. Claw gouges in the bark starting at about chest level and running upward in 4-line sets, deep enough that the pale would underneath showed through. He stood at the base of the tree and looked up, and the marks went up higher than made sense, higher than a bear would reach even standing, and the space in between the lines was wrong for a bear anyway. Too close together, the individual marks too narrow. Ray stood beside him and looked at them for a long moment and said mountain lion, and Don did not say anything because there had not been mountain lions in this part of the state for a long time, and whatever made these marks, he did not think it was a mountain lion. They did not tell Mitch and Cal about the tree right away. They got back to the cabin first, and Mitch had lunch going, and Cal was sitting at the kitchen table looking like he had not slept well, which he probably had not, and the mood was already flat enough without adding to it. Don pulled Mitch aside after they ate and took him out to see the tree, and Mitch stood at the base of it and looked at the marks for a long time without saying anything the way Mitch did when he was thinking hard about something. Then he said the spacing is about 4 inches between each mark, and Don said, yeah, and Mitch said, and they go up to 9 feet, and Don said something like that, and Mitch looked at the marks a while longer, and then they walked back to the cabin and did not talk about it on the way. The afternoon was restless. Nobody hunted. Ray worked on his gear at the kitchen table, and Cal slept for a couple of hours in the back bedroom, and Mitch sat on the porch for a long time looking at the tree line, without appearing to be looking at anything in particular. Don tried to read, and could not focus, and kept finding himself at the windows. The dogs did not go outside at all. Buck lay by the stove with his head on his paws and his eyes open, and Diesel had wedged himself into the corner beside the woodpile and stayed there, which was not like Diesel at all. By the time it got dark, they had the lights on in every room without discussing it, and dinner was quiet, and afterward nobody suggested cards. They just sat in the main room with the fire going, the lights on, and the darkness pressing against the windows the way darkness does when you are aware of it. It was Mitch who heard it first. He put his hand up without saying anything, and everybody went still, and then they all heard it, a slow, irregular sound from somewhere outside, somewhere around the far side of the cabin, like something moving to the leaves but taking its time, stopping, moving again. Ray said raccoon, and his voice came out lower than normal. The sound stopped and then started again closer along the back wall, and both dogs were on their feet now, Buck at the interior wall with his hackles up, and Diesel pressed against Don's leg trembling. Don picked up the big flashlight from the kitchen counter and went to the back window and looked out and saw nothing but dark, and then he opened the window a few inches and pushed the light out and swept it along the tree line, and that was when he caught the eyes. They were far back in the trees, far enough that the beam barely reached them, and they caught the light the way animal eyes do, but the position was wrong. Too high off the ground and too far apart, and they did not blink, and they did not move, just held the light back at him from the dark between the trees. He kept the beam on them for a long count, and then they were gone, not moving away, just gone, the way a light goes out. He pulled the window shut and latched it. Ray asked what he saw, and Don said probably deer, and Ray looked at him for a second and let it go. It was close to midnight when Don heard his name. He was still awake, sitting in the chair by the stove with the fire burned low, and it came from just outside the front wall, quiet enough that he was not certain he heard it all, just the shape of the word in the air, Don, barely more than a breath. a quality to it that he could not describe except that it did not sound like the wind, and it did not sound like an animal, and it was gone before he could decide if it had been real. He sat very still for a long time after that, and did not move, and did not sleep, and by the time the gray light started coming to the windows again, he had made up his mind that in the morning he was going to tell the others everything. The thing he had seen the first night, the eyes in the trees, all of it, and they were going to decide together what they were going to do, because something was out there, and it had been out there since before they arrived, and it already knew his name. He went through it in his head while he waited for the others to wake up, how he would say it, how much detail to give. And he kept coming back to the same problem, which was that none of it sounded like anything when he put it into words. A shape at the tree line, eyes in the dark, his name in the air outside the wall at midnight. Ray was going to tell him it was a deer in his imagination and bad sleep, and Don was not sure Ray would be wrong, except that he had been coming to these woods for 11 years, and he had never felt watched before, and he felt watched now, had felt it since they pulled up the dirt track yesterday morning, and the dogs froze at the tree line, had felt it every time he stood at a window after dark and looked out at the tree line, and had the distinct and specific sensation of something on the other side of that glass looking back. Mitch was up before the others, the way Mitch always was, and he came out of the back bedroom and poured himself a coffee and sat down across from Don without saying anything and looked at him for a moment and said, "You didn't sleep?" And Don said no, and Mitch said me either, and they sat with that for a minute, and then Don told him about the name. Mitch listened without interrupting, and when Don was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want to show you something." And he got up and went to the front door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch, and Don followed him. The claw marks were on the doorframe, for lines gouged into the wood of the left doorframe from about knee-height up to above the top of the door. Deep and clean, the same narrow spacing as the marks on the tree in the woods. They had not been there yesterday. Don stood on the porch in the cold morning air and looked at them and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. Mitch sat there on the bedroom window sill too, the back bedroom, outside, and Don looked at him and Mitch looked back, and neither of them said anything else for a moment. Ray came out onto the porch with his coffee and saw them both standing there looking at the doorframe and said, "What?" And Don pointed at the marks, and Ray leaned in and looked at them and then stood up and looked at the tree line and said, "Okay," and then went back inside without another word, which was so unlike Ray that it was almost more unsettling than the marks themselves. They told Cal over breakfast, and Cal sat very still while they talked and then looked at his coffee cup for a long time and said, "So what do we do?" And nobody had a good answer for that yet. Ray was the one who pushed back first, which was not surprising. He said they had claw marks on a tree and claw marks on the doorframe, and Don thought he heard something outside at night, and he was not saying that was nothing, but he was also not ready to pack up and leave over it. He said they had driven 3 hours and taken time off work, and he wanted to know what exactly they thought they were running from before he threw the trip away. Mitch said he was not saying they should leave. He was saying they should be smart about it, stay together, keep the lights on at night, not go anywhere alone. Cal said he agreed with Mitch, and Ray looked at Don, and Don said, "I think whatever's out there has been watching this cabin for a while, and I think it was watching it before we got here, and I think we need to take that seriously." And Ray looked at him for a long moment, and then nodded once, and said, "All right," and that was the closest Ray had ever come to admitting he was scared without actually saying it. They spent the rest of the morning inside, close together, the fire going, the dogs restless and unhappy, and the woods outside as quiet as they had been since they arrived, that deep pressed-down silence that by now none of them were pretending was normal anymore. Don refilled his coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard and the tree line beyond it and thought about the shape he had seen standing there 2 nights ago and wondered how long before that had already been out there watching. How many nights it had stood at the edge of those trees looking at the dark cabin before they arrived, and whether it had been waiting for them specifically, or whether they were simply the next one to show up. The debate about leaving started after breakfast and went in circles for the better part of an hour. Ray was still the holdout, not because he was not rattled. Don could see in the way he kept his back to the wall when he sat down and the way his eyes were in the windows, but because Ray had never in his life backed down from anything without a fight, and leaving felt like backing down. He kept coming back to the same argument, that they had claw marks in silence, and one thing Don may or may not have seen in the dark 2 nights ago, and that was not enough to pull the pin on the whole trip. Mitch listened to him go through it twice, and then said, "Ray, I have been in situations where something felt wrong and I ignored it, and I have been in situations where something felt wrong and I did not ignore it, and I am still here because of the second kind." And that was the most words Mitch had strung together at one time in recent memory, and it landed. Ray was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Fine, one more night. And if anything else happens, we go in the morning." And nobody argued with that, because it was the best they were going to get out of Ray without a full confrontation, and none of them had the stomach for that on top of everything else. The morning passed slowly. They stayed close to the cabin, did not hunt, kept the dogs inside. Cal had not said much since breakfast, and Don noticed he kept flinching at small sounds. A log settling in the stove, a branch moving outside, things that would not have registered 2 days ago. Don did not say anything about it. He understood it. The woods that had always felt like the best place he knew had started feeling like something else entirely, and he could not have said exactly when the switch happened. Sometime in the night, maybe, sometime between hearing his name at the wall and finding the marks on the doorframe in the morning. Just after noon, Cal said he was going to check on the trucks, make sure everything was good to go for the morning, and Mitch said he would go with him, and they went out together, which was the right call, nobody alone, the way they had agreed. Don watched them cross the yard from the kitchen window. They got to the trucks, and Cal went around to the driver's side of his, and Mitch walked around the front of Don's, and then Don saw Cal stop. He had come around the back end of his truck and stopped completely still, and Don was moving toward the door before he had consciously decided to, because he knew from the way Cal stopped that something was wrong. He got to the porch, and Cal was backing up slow, deliberate steps away from the truck, his eyes fixed on the roof of the cab, and Don followed his eye line and saw it. It was crouched on top of Cal's truck with his long fingers wrapped over the edge of the roof on both sides, pale and hairless and thin in a way that seemed impossible, the bones of its shoulders visible beneath the skin, its face turned directly toward Cal. It was not large. That was the thing Don's brain kept snagging on in the seconds that followed. It was not some giant thing. It was roughly the size of a person, a very thin person, but the proportions were wrong in ways that were hard to look at directly. The limbs too long, the head tilted at an angle that did not seem comfortable, the fingers too many jointed where they gripped the metal. Don stepped off the porch, and it turned its head and looked at him. The eyes were dark and deeply set, and they caught the flat gray daylight the way an animal's eyes do not quite catch light, and it looked at him the way something looks at you when it is not afraid of you at all, when it is simply deciding something. Then it dropped, not fell, dropped, deliberate and controlled, off the side of the truck and into the tree line in one movement, so fast that by the time Don had crossed, half the yard was gone, and the trees were still, and there was nothing there. Cal was standing in the middle of the yard, breathing hard, and Mitch had come around from the other side of the truck, and the three of them stood there for a moment in the silence. Then they went inside, and Don locked the door behind them. Ray was standing in the middle of the main room, and he looked at their faces and said what happened, and Mitch told him, plain and factual, the way Mitch told things, and Ray sat down slowly on the edge of the couch and did not say anything for a while. Don made coffee because he needed something to do with his hands, and Cal sat at the kitchen table and stared at the surface of it, and Mitch stood at the window and watched the tree line. Nobody brought up staying another night again. They agreed they would leave at first light, pack tonight, be ready to move the moment there was enough light to drive the track out. They kept every light in the cabin burning through the afternoon and into the evening. The wood stove cranked up, the dogs close. Don called Linda on the landline and got through on the second try and heard her voice and held the phone and said everything was fine. They were heading out in the morning. He would call when they had signal. She asked if he was okay, and he said yes, and she said he did not sound okay, and he said he was just tired. And she let it go the way she always let things go when she knew pushing would not get her anywhere. After he hung up, he stood at the kitchen counter for a moment and thought about how far away she was, and how far away everything normal was, and how the 3 hours of road between here and the rest of the world had never felt so long. That night, Cal started hearing things the others could not hear. It began around 9, him tilting his head at moments when the rest of them heard nothing, looking toward the walls or the windows with an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between confusion and fear. Don asked him twice what he was hearing, and Cal said voices, just outside, too low to make out, and the second time he said his hands were shaking around his coffee cup. Mitch moved closer to him without making a thing of it, and Ray stopped pretending to look at his phone and put it down, and the four of them sat together in the bright lit room while the fire burned, and outside the woods were completely silent, and Cal sat there listening to something none of the rest of them could hear, and by the look on his face, it was not anything good. Don watched Cal and tried to remember if Cal had slept it all night before and could not remember seeing him sleep, and thought about what Mitch had said once a long time ago about sleep deprivation, how it did things to a person, how the brain started filling in gaps with things that were not there. He wanted to believe that was what this was. He wanted to believe it badly enough that he almost said it out loud, but then he thought about the thing on top of the truck, and the way it looked at him across the yard, without any fear, and he did not say it. Around 10:30, Cal went very still, and said it's right outside, and his voice was barely above a whisper. Don looked at Mitch, and Mitch was already moving, slow and quiet, to the window beside the front door, positioning himself to look out at an angle, without putting himself directly in front of the glass. He looked for a long moment, and then went still in particular way Mitch went still when something required his complete attention. And Don crossed the stand beside him and looked where Mitch was looking and saw it. It was at the window, not at the tree line, not at the edge of the yard, at the window, close enough that his face was visible in the light spilling from inside the cabin, pale and angular and wrong, the dark eyes moving slowly across the room, across Don, across Mitch, across Ray, who was on his feet in the middle of the room, across Cal, who had not moved and was sitting with his eyes closed and his hands flat on the table. It did not react to being seen. It simply continued looking slowly and deliberately, the way you look at something you are studying before you decide what to do about it. Don stood at the window and looked back at it, and did not move, and it did not move, and it was gone, just gone, and the window showed nothing but the dark yard and the tree line beyond it. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Ray said in a voice Don had never heard from him before, low and stripped of everything, "We are leaving in the morning, and that is it." And Don said yes, and Mitch said yes, and Cal opened his eyes and looked at the window and said, "Is it gone?" And Mitch said yes, and Cal nodded and said good. Don kept every light on all night. He did not sleep, and he did not think anyone else did either. And by the time the first gray light came to the edges of the windows, he was already pulling on his boots, already thinking about the road and the signal coming back at the second ridge, and what does it feel like to be on the other side of all this. He did not let himself think about whether it was going to let them leave. He just moved, kept moving, packed his bag and checked the lock on the door, and stood in the middle of the bright-lit cabin, and waited for it to be light enough to go, listening to the silence outside that had stopped feeling like quiet and started feeling like something holding its breath. The packing took less time than it should have, because nobody was being careful about it. Things going into bags without much thought, just get it together, just be ready. Mitch was the most methodical even now, moving to the cabin room by room, checking windows, making sure nothing essential was left behind, and Don followed his lead because focusing on practical was the only thing keeping the fear at a manageable level. Ray loaded the cooler and broke down his rifle and cased it and set it by the door and did not look at the windows while he worked. Cal packed his bag and then sat on the edge of the bed in the back bedroom with it between his feet and stared at the floor, and Don found him there and sat with him for a few minutes without saying anything, because there was nothing useful to say Cal had not heard the whispers again since the thing appeared the window, or if he had not said so, and he looked hollowed out in a way that sleep deprivation alone did not account for. Don put a hand on his shoulder briefly, and Cal nodded and stood up and picked up his bag, and that was enough. By 5 a.m, they were all in the main room, bags by the door, dogs leashed, fire banked, and they stood together in the light and waited for dawn without talking about any of it. The light outside went from black to gray, and Don unlocked the door, and they went out together into the cold, still air to find out what was waiting for them. The yard was empty. That was the first thing. The yard was empty, and the tree line was still, and the trucks were sitting where they had left them, and nothing was on top of either of them, and the morning air was cold and flat and smelled like dead leaves and frost. Don stood on the porch for a moment and looked at all of it, and then stepped down into the yard, and the others followed him. Mitch with Diesel on the leash and Ray with Buck, Cal carrying the last 2 bags. They moved to the trucks without running. Nobody wanted to be the one who ran, but they moved fast and with purpose, and Don had his keys out before he reached the driver door. He unlocked it and threw his bag in the back and got behind the wheel and put the key in and turned it. Nothing. Not a grind, not a click, not a slow turnover that suggested a dead battery. Just nothing, as if the key were going into a lock that was not connected to anything. He tried it again. Nothing. He looked at Mitch through the windshield, and Mitch was already at the hood, already popping it. And Don got out, and they looked at the engine together, and everything appeared to be exactly as it should be. Battery connections tight. Nothing obviously wrong. Nothing pulled or cut or tampered with in any way they could see. Mitch got into the driver's seat and tried it himself and got the same nothing, and got back out and stood there with his hands on his hips looking at the engine. And Don watched his face and did not like what he saw on it. Cal tried his truck. Same thing. Ray tried both of them in sequence, methodical, the way Ray got when he was angry and trying not to show it, and got nothing from either one, and then stood in the space between the 2 trucks and said out loud to nobody, in particular, what did it do, and Mitch said he did not know, and Ray said, well, it did something, and Mitch said, yes, it did. They stood there for a moment. The woods around them were completely silent. Buck sat on the ground beside Ray's leg, and Diesel was pressed against Mitch's calf, and both dogs were facing the tree line, and neither of them was making any sound at all, which by now all 4 men understood was worse than growling. Don looked at the tree line and looked at the trucks and looked at the 3 miles of dirt track and then forest road between them and the main road and said, we go on foot, and nobody argued. They went back inside long enough to grab what they needed, weapons, water, the dog leashes, Don's compass, and left everything else. Don took the lockbox key off the hook by the door out of pure habit, and then looked at it in his hand and set it back down. Mitch checked his rifle and handed Cal the spare handgun from his bag, and Ray had his own, and Don had his, and that was what they had, and Don did not know what good it would do them, but having it helped. They left the cabin with all the lights on. Don did not know why that felt important, but it did, leaving it lit up in the gray morning like something still lived there, like they were just stepping out for a bit and would be back. He pulled the door shut behind him and did not look back at it. The track out was 3 miles to the forest road, and then another 1.5 miles on the forest road to the main road, 4.5 miles total on a good day in good conditions, which these were not because the cold front had brought a light freezing drizzle overnight, and the track was slick in places, and the footing was uneven, and Cal was already moving stiffly in a way that suggested he was operating on no sleep and fraying nerves and not much else. They moved in a loose single file, with Mitch at the front and Don at the back and the dogs between them, and they made decent time for the first mile, the track wide enough to see ahead, and the gray light filtering down to the canopy enough to see by. It was Don who first noticed a feeling of being followed. It was not a sound, not at first. It was just the same feeling he had been carrying since the first morning, the weight of being watched, except now it was moving with them, tracking them through the trees to the left of the track, staying just far enough in that he could not see anything definite, just the sense of something keeping pace. He did not say anything immediately. He watched the trees to the left and kept walking and tried to identify something concrete to report and could not. Just a feeling in the way Buck kept turning his head that direction and then away, that direction and away. The nervous rhythmic check an animal that knows something is there but cannot pin it down. Then Mitch stopped. He stopped without a word and raised his fist, and they all stopped behind him and stood still and listened, and in the silence Don heard it, a single soft sound from the trees to the right. The other side of the track now, unhurried, like something shifting its weight. Mitch said quietly without turning around, "Is on both sides," and Don said yes, and Ray said, "So it is hurting us," and Mitch said, "That is what it looks like," and Ray said, "Great." And they stood there for a moment in the drizzle and the silence with the trees on both sides of them and the track stretching ahead and behind. And Don thought about the way it had looked at him from the truck roof, that calm assessing look, and thought about the fact that it had disabled the trucks overnight without any of them hearing a thing, and thought about the fact that it had been out here in these woods long before they arrived and knew every inch of this ground, and they did not. And he understood that whatever happened next was going to happen on its terms, and not theirs. And the only thing they could do was keep moving toward the road, and stay together, and not give a reason to stop watching, and start doing something else. He said keep moving, and Mitch started walking, and they all followed. And the trees on both sides stayed close and quiet, and whatever was in them kept pace the whole way without showing itself. And the road was still a long way off. The second mile was harder. The track dipped down through a low stretch where the trees came in tighter on both sides, and the canopy closed overhead, and the light dropped enough that the gray morning felt closer to dusk than midday. The drizzle had picked up, and the cold was settling deeper, and Cal had gone very quiet behind Don in a way that was starting to worry him. Don glanced back every few minutes to check, and each time Cal was there, moving, keeping up, but his face had taken on a fixed look that Don recognized as someone operating on willpower alone with not much left in reserve. Mitch maintained the pace at the front, steady and even, compass out and checked regularly, not rushing but not letting anyone slow either. The sound in the trees had not stopped, subtle enough that if you were not listening for them you might miss them. A branch flex here, a soft compression of leaves there, but consistent and moving with the group, and by the second mile nobody was pretending not to hear them anymore. Ray had moved up close behind Mitch, and Don appreciated that because it meant the group was tighter and harder to separate, which he suspected was exactly what those sounds were designed to do. The track bent left around a long curve, and when they came out at the tree line on the left, opened briefly into a small clearing, and Mitch stopped, and this time Don saw it too, at the far edge of the clearing, standing at the base of the tree with one hand against the bark, watching them. It was not hiding. It stood in the open in the flat gray light, and looked at them the same way it had looked at everything, unhurried. Like time was different for it than it was for them. They all saw it. Nobody raised a weapon. Don was not entirely sure why. Some instinct that doing so would change what this was into something worse. Cross a line that had not yet been crossed. They looked at it, and it looked at them, and Mitch said, "Keep walking." And they kept walking, and when Don looked back 30 seconds later, the clearing was empty. Nobody spoke for a long stretch after that. The dogs stayed pressed and close, and the sounds continued in the trees, and the main road was still more than 2 miles out, and Don put one foot in front of the other and kept Cal moving and stayed tight with the group, and did not let himself think beyond the next section of track, because those were the only things within his control right now, and that was going to have to be enough. Ray said how much farther, and Mitch said under 2 miles, and Ray said okay, and that was all any of them said for a long time, walking through the gray wet cold with the trees on both sides, and whatever lived in them keeping pace with every step they took toward the road. The last stretch was where Ray got hurt. They had made the forest road, and were moving well, when Buck lunged on his leash and Ray yanked him back, and they all stopped and looked at the tree line to the right, and saw nothing. And then it came out fast and low, and Ray threw his arm up, and the claws caught him across the forearm before Diesel went for it, and it pulled back into the trees, and was gone in under 3 seconds. Ray was down on one knee with his arm pressed to his chest, and Don was beside him, and it was bad, for deep lines bleeding hard through the jacket sleeve. And Don got his own jacket off and pressed it tight against the wounds and tied it off and got Ray up, and Ray said he was fine, and they started moving faster. The sound stayed back after that, further out in the trees, and Don thought it had done what it wanted and was content now to watch them finish the walk. The main road came through the trees like something Don had not let himself fully believe in, and they came out onto the shoulder and stopped, and Don looked both ways down the empty road and felt something loosen in his chest for the first time in 3 days. Mitch stood at the edge of the asphalt and looked back into the forest road, and Don stood beside him and looked with him, and there was nothing there, just the dark trees and the drizzle falling through them. Don turned away and faced the road and said, "We need a car," and Mitch said yes, and they started walking. Behind them, the forest road sat silent and dark, and the drizzle came down through it, and Don did not look back at it again, because he already knew that if he did, he would see something at the edge of the trees watching them go, and he did not need to see it again to know it was there. They walked the road for 20 minutes before headlights appeared. It was a Tulane County road that did not get much traffic on a weekday morning in October, and Don had been trying not to think about what they would do if nobody came. Whether they would walk the full 12 miles to town with Ray's arm wrapped in a soaked jacket, and Cal running on nothing, and the dogs exhausted, and whatever was back in those trees, still aware of exactly where they were. The headlights came around the bend slow and steady, and Don stepped into the road and raised both arms, and the car slowed and stopped, and the window came down, and a woman looked out at them, middle-aged, sensible coat, a thermos in the cup holder, and a confused expression that shifted toward alarm when she got a look at Ray's arm. She said, "Lord, what happened to you all?" And Don said, "We need to get to town." And she said, "Get in." And that was a whole conversation. No explanation asked for, no story given, just 4 men and 2 dogs folding themselves into a Subaru wagon on the shoulder of a county road in the drizzle, and the woman. She said her name was Peggy Dawson, said it like it was important to establish that she was a real person in a real car, and not something they'd imagined. Pulling back onto the road, without another word and driving, Ray sat in the front with his arm in his lap, and Don sat behind him, and Mitch and Cal were in the back with the dogs across their legs, and nobody talked for the first few miles. Peggy turned the heat up without being asked, and Don leaned his head back against the seat and looked at the ceiling of the car and felt the miles accumulating between them and the woods, and did not let himself feel anything about it yet, because it was still Ray's arm to deal with, and still the task of getting home, and he could not afford to let the thing that had been sitting on his chest for 3 days out until all that was handled. Peggy asked once if she should call someone, and Don said if she could get them to the urgent care in town, that was all they needed, and she said of course, and that was that. He watched the trees going past on both sides of the road, and thought about the way they looked from inside them, close and dark, and full of something that watched without showing itself, and from a road, they just looked like trees, the ordinary October trees of an ordinary county road. Nothing in them, nothing watching, just bark and branches, and the last of the season's leaves coming down in the drizzle. And he understood that this was a thing that made it impossible to explain to anyone who had not been there, that the woods looked like woods, and the road looked like a road, and there was no evidence of anything except Ray's arm and 4 men, who looked like they had not slept in 3 days, which was not the kind of evidence that told the story accurately. Mitch had not said anything since they got in the car. Don looked at him, and Mitch was sitting with Diesel across his lap, looking out the window at the passing trees with the same steady, unreadable expression he had worn for most of the last 3 days, and Don thought about what Mitch had said on the drive up, for days ago, a lifetime ago, something about the hunting being good this year, about the weather looking right, and he thought about how thoroughly and completely that version of this trip had been replaced by what it had actually become. Cal had his eyes closed and his head against the window, and Don could not tell if he was asleep or just done, just finished. And it did not matter, because either way he had earned it. The urgent care was a small clinic on the main street of town that existed primarily to serve the hunting and fishing crowd that passed through the area in season, which meant the woman at the front desk did not visibly react to four disheveled men coming to the door with a dog-leashed arm injury at 8:30 in the morning, just asked for insurance and pointed them toward the chairs. Peggy had pulled over in the parking lot, and Don had leaned back into the passenger window and thanked her, and she had looked at him with particular expression of someone who has decided not to ask questions they do not want answers to, and said, "You boys take care of yourselves," and pulled away. Ray's arm needed cleaning and closing and took about an hour, and Don sat in the waiting room with Mitch and Cal and the dogs, and did not look at his phone, and did not talk, and just sat with the heat coming to the vents above him and the sound of the town outside going about its morning the way towns did, indifferent and ordinary and completely unaware that 4 miles up the county road in the woods there was something that had spent 3 nights watching a cabin and had learned their names and had put its hands on one of them before letting them go. When Ray came out, his arm was wrapped properly, and he had color back in his face, and he looked at the 3 of them sitting in the waiting room chairs and said, "Let's go home," and they stood up and walked out into the gray October morning. And Don called Linda from the parking lot and heard her pick up on the second ring and said they were on their way, and she said, "Okay, good," and he said he would explain later, and she said, "Okay," and he stood there for a moment after he hung up holding the phone and looking at the tree line at the far edge of town, a solid dark mass of trees against the white sky, ordinary and still, and he put the phone in his pocket and turned away from it and got in the car. Mitch drove because Mitch always drove when nobody else was in shape to, and Don sat in the passenger seat and watched the road unwind, and the miles came off steadily, and the trees gave way to fields, and then to small towns, and then to the highway, and somewhere past the second ridge Don's phone buzzed with a string of notifications catching up from the last 3 days, and he looked at the screen and did not open any of them. The highway was busy the way highways were on weekday mornings, and the traffic around them was full of people going to work and school and ordinary places, and Don watched them and thought about how completely separate that world was from what had been happening 4 miles up a county road in the woods, and how easily the two things existed side by side, without touching. The ordinary world and the thing that lived in those trees, going about their business in parallel, and how nobody driving past them on the highway had any idea and never would. Cal fell asleep within the first 20 minutes on the highway, genuinely asleep, head against the window, breathing slow, and Don was glad for it. Ray sat in the back with his wrapped arm in his lap and his eyes open and did not talk, which was so unlike Ray that under any other circumstances Don would have been worried, but he understood it and left it alone. The drive back was 3 hours the same as the drive up had been, and it felt nothing like it. The drive up had been full of the anticipation Don associated with the trip every year, the loosening feeling, the world dropping away. And the drive back was something else, a different kind of silence, for men carrying something that had no shape yet, something that had not looked at directly and were not ready to, sitting between them the way difficult things sit between people who have been through something together and not yet figured out what it means or what to do with it. Mitch pulled off once for gas, and they all got out and stood at a station that looked like every gas station in the world, and a family pulled up on the other side of the pump with kids in the back seat, and Don watched them and felt very far away from them in a way that had nothing to do with distance. Nobody said anything about what had happened, not at the gas station, and not back in the car, and not as the highway gave way to the roads that meant they were nearly home. Mitch dropped Ray first, and Ray got out and took his case rifle and stood at the window a moment and looked at Don and said something short, and Don said yeah, and Ray went inside. Cal next, the same, out and up his driveway without looking back. Mitch pulled up in front of Don's house last and stopped with the engine running, and Don sat for a moment and said thanks, and Mitch said yep, and Don got out and got his bag and stood in his own driveway, and the front door opened, and Linda was there, and he walked up to her, and she looked at his face and did not ask anything yet, just stepped back and let him in, and he went inside, and she closed the door and the house was warm and quiet, and he stood in the hallway and listened to the silence, and it was just silence, just the ordinary silence of a house on a weekday morning. Nothing in it, nothing watching, and he stood in it for a long moment before he could make himself move. Linda made him eat something, and he ate it without tasting it, and then she sat across from him at the kitchen table and waited, and he told her some of it, not all of it, enough to explain Ray's arm and why they had come back early and why he looked the way he looked. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he had always valued about her. The particular quality of attention she brought to things that required it, and when he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Are you okay?" And he said yes, and she looked at him for a moment the way she looked at him when she was deciding whether to push, and then she said, "Okay," and reached across and put her hand over his, and that was enough. That was all he needed from anyone right now. He slept that afternoon for 4 hours. The first real sleep he had gotten since the drive up, and it was deep and without dreams that he could remember, and when he woke up the light in the room was a low orange light of late afternoon, and the house was quiet, and Buck was on the floor at the foot of the bed, and Don lay there and looked at the ceiling and let himself understand that it was over. They were out. Everyone was home. Ray's arm was going to be fine. And whatever was back in those, Woods was back in those woods and not here. He lay there and told himself that until he believed it. He got up and went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and stood at the sink and looked out at the backyard, the fence, the ordinary suburban trees at the back of the lot backing up to nothing wilder than another neighborhood. And the yard was just a yard, just the grass and the fence and the bird feeder and the last leaves on the ground. And there was nothing there, and after a while he felt his shoulders come down from where they had been for 3 days, and he put the glass in the sink and went to find Linda. Nobody talked about it for 2 weeks. That was not a decision they made together. There was no conversation where they agreed to let it sit. It just happened the way things happen between people who have been through something they do not have language for yet. A mutual and unspoken understanding that the thing needed time before anyone was going to be able to say anything useful about it. Don went back to work on Monday. He answered emails and sat in meetings and ate lunch at his desk and drove home and had dinner with Linda and watched television and went to bed. And he did all of it the way you do things when you're going through the motions while some part of your brain is somewhere else entirely, parked in a county road in the drizzle looking back at the tree line. He slept okay, which surprised him. He had expected the nights to be the hard part, and they were not, or not in the way he had anticipated. No nightmares, no waking in a cold sweat, just a heaviness that sat on him through the days and lifted slightly in the evenings and came back in the mornings. Ray called on the Wednesday of the second week, and they talked for 20 minutes about nothing related to trip. And at the end, Ray said his arm was healing clean, and Don said good, and they were quiet for a moment, and Ray said, "I keep thinking about the truck," and Don said, "Me too," and Ray said, "Whatever it did to those trucks, it did it without making a sound," and Don said, "Yeah," and Ray said, "That bothers me more than anything else," and Don said, "I know," and they left it there and said goodbye and hung up. Mitch texted twice, brief and factual, once to say he was doing fine, once to send a link to a forum thread he had found. No message attached, just a link. Don clicked it and read it on his phone sitting in his car in the work parking lot at lunch, and the thread was full of accounts from hunters and campers and people who had been in remote areas in various parts of the country, different states, different years. And the details in each one were wrong in slightly different ways, but the shape of every account was the same. The silence first, the watching, the escalation over multiple nights, the feeling of being studied, and more than one account mentioned the whispers, the names spoken from just outside in the dark. And Don sat in his car and read all of it, and then sat there for a while longer not reading anything, and then went back inside. Cal was the one Don was most worried about. He had texted in the first week, short responses, still here, doing okay. But he had not called, and he had not answered when Don called him twice, and that was not like Cal, who was not someone who went quiet for long under ordinary circumstances. Don drove to his apartment on a Saturday afternoon and knocked, and Cal answered and looked like someone who had not been sleeping well at all. Not the manageable version of tired that Don had been carrying, but a deeper kind, the kind that got into a person's eyes and stayed there. Don came inside, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Cal said he'd been hearing the whispers again, and Don went still, and Cal said not outside, not at the window, just in his head, when it got quiet, or when he was almost asleep, just at the edge of things, his own name in that same low voice, and he could not tell anymore whether he was remembering it or hearing it, and either way it did not stop. Don sat with that for a moment, and then said, "Have you slept?" And Cal said, "Not much," and Don said, "Need to talk to someone." And Cal looked at him, and Don said, "I mean it, a doctor, someone, because whatever this is, it is not something you sit with alone." And Cal looked at the table for a long moment, and then nodded, and Don took that as enough for now, and stayed another hour, and made sure Cal ate something before he left. He thought about Cal on the drive home, and thought about the thing in the woods, and the way it had seemed to single Cal out, the whispers that only Cal could hear, the particular attention it had paid him out of the four of them, and he did not know what to make of that except that whatever the watching phase was for, whatever information it was gathering in those long, still hours at the tree line, it had found something in Cal that it had not found in the same way in the others, and he did. Not like thinking about what that meant. 3 weeks after they got back, Don was standing at the kitchen window late on a Thursday night. Later than he usually stayed up, a glass of water in his hand, the same as the first night at the cabin. And he was looking out at the backyard, without thinking about anything in particular, when Buck got up from his spot by the back door and walked the door and stood there facing it and did not make a sound, just stood there completely still with his nose half an inch from the wood, and the hair on the back of Don's neck went up before his brain had finished processing what he was seeing. He stood at the window and looked at Buck, and Buck did not move, and the backyard beyond the door was dark and ordinary, and the fence was there, and the bird feeder was there, and the suburban tree line at the back of the lot was there, and Don stood very still and looked at it for a long time and tried to find something wrong with it and could not find anything wrong with it, and Buck stood at the door and did not move and did not make a sound, and the yard was dark and quiet, and Don stood at the window and looked out at it and felt the particular cold certainty of a man who has seen something once and knows what it feels like and is trying very hard to believe he is wrong. And he stood there and looked and did not move and did not breathe and waited to find out if anything out there in the dark was looking back. The next morning he called Mitch. He did not tell him about the backyard or Buck at the door. He was not ready to say that out loud yet. He just called, and they talked the way they had been talking, around the edges of the thing rather than directly at it. And somewhere in the middle of it, Mitch said, "There is something I did not tell you," and Don said, "Okay." And Mitch said, "When we got to Main Road, when I looked back into the forest road, I saw it." Don was quiet, and Mitch said it was standing at the far end of the forest road at the edge where the trees close in, and it was watching us get in the car, and it did not move. It just stood there, and I watched it until we drove out of sight, and it never moved, and I did not say anything because I did not see what good would have done at that point, and Don said you were right, and Mitch said, "I know, but I wanted you to know anyway," and Don said, "I appreciate it," and they were quiet for a moment, and then Don said, "Do you think it stays in those woods?" And Mitch said, "I think it has a territory the same as any animal, and I think that territory is those woods, and I think we walked into it, and I think it did what it does, and now it is done with us." And Don said, and Cal, and Mitch was quiet for a beat, and then said, "I think Cal's going to be okay." And Don said, "You think?" And Mitch said, "I think." And that was the most uncertainty Don had ever heard in Mitch's voice about anything, and it stayed with him after they hung up. He did not go back to the window that night, or the night after. He went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept and did not stand in the dark kitchen looking at the backyard, and he told himself that was the right approach, that giving it attention was a wrong instinct, that the best thing he could do was put behind him the way you put things behind you, deliberately and completely, and get back to the life he had been living before October. He went back to work. He and Linda had people over for dinner on a Friday, and it was ordinary and good, and he laughed at something someone said and meant it, and that felt like progress. Ray's arm healed, and Ray sent a photo of it at 3 weeks. The lines fading the scar, and underneath the photo, he wrote "Still here," and Don wrote back same. and that was enough. Cal called on a Sunday 6 weeks after they got back and sounded better, genuinely better, not just managing, and said he'd been talking to someone and it was helping and the whispers had gotten quieter, and Don said that is good news, and Cal said yeah, and they talked for a while about nothing serious, and it was almost normal, almost the way things had been before. And when they hung up, Don sat with the phone in his hand for a moment and felt something he recognized as close to relief. He did not tell any of them about Buck at the door. He was not sure what he would say, even if he did, because nothing had happened. Buck had stood at the door and Don had stood at the window, and the yard had been dark and quiet, and eventually Buck had turned around and gone back to his spot by the stove, and Don had rinsed his glass and gone to bed, and in the morning the yard had been exactly as it always was. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself that the way he had told himself the shape at the tree line on the first night was a deer standing at the kitchen window with a glass of water in the dark. And he went about his days, and he did not stand at the windows after midnight, and he kept the back porch light on every night without explaining to Linda why. And some days that was enough, and some days it was not. And those were the days he found himself doing what he was doing right now, standing at the kitchen window in the dark with a glass of water in his hand, looking out at the backyard, not because he wanted to, but because something in him needed a check, needed to look, and he looked, and the yard was quiet, and the fence was there, and the bird feeder was there, and the tree line at the back of the lot was dark and still and ordinary, and he stood there and looked at it and waited for it to stay that way. He finished his water and rinsed the glass and set it in the sink and turned off the kitchen light and stood there for a moment in the dark with the glow of the back porch light coming to the window and the yard lit in that flat yellow way, and Buck asleep on the floor behind him, breathing slow, and nothing moving out there, nothing at the fence, nothing at the tree line, just the ordinary dark of a suburban backyard on an ordinary night. And he turned away from the window and walked down the hall to bed,